Now, just give us more of a sense. We're seeing lots of these flare-ups. What was it like to be in that community today?
Well, it certainly was quite volatile when we got there in the morning. You know, the communities are so angry, and it really takes very little to trigger them into protesting. And when we got there, the community had blocked off, the main artillery route into Kagiso, which is Randfontein Road. So that meant that motorists couldn't get in and out for the large part of the day, and it really was quite a frustration to the motorists, to the school children that had to access those roads. And while the protesters' fight was legitimate, or their protest was legitimate around the issue of lack of electricity, you know, these are really the bread and butter issues that stick to the core of a lot of these communities. And that's why they get angered, and that's why they end up going on a protest. No electricity for 3 weeks. We had load shedding for a couple of weeks, and it was quite difficult for many of us who come from privilege to deal with the issue of load shedding. But for these communities where it's a case of Eskom says they're not able to pay for their electricity consumption, they're going to switch them off, and they're not going to give them valid reasons, and they're not going to give them somebody to speak to them and say, well, you know, this is why we have switched you guys off, and for you to be reconnected, you need to do A, B, C, and D.
So,
and it's
so
very
was Eskom
frustrating.
saying this was about debt at all?
Yes, it's about a historic debt where the community. So there's two elements to this. Eskom, in 2016, came into the area and it installed metered electricity to some of the residents, or to some of the different blocks, but not everyone. And now Eskom then shut off the entire community and didn't shut off those who weren't paying for the electricity. So everybody ended up suffering as a result. So the community leaders in today's protest managed to speak to somebody from Eskom, and Eskom has said to them that they will try and bring in their technicians to do an audit of really what the problems are and which are the problem areas, and how they can find resolutions to relight for those people who are, who've been switched off, and those who haven't been switched off. And it's been very difficult. It's been quite cold the past couple of days, and a lot of the residents are saying that they haven't had electricity to take warm baths. They haven't had electricity to cook. They've had to rely on, lighting fires to be able to use the old-fashioned way of cooking for themselves. The children are hungry. The children are cold, and it's quite difficult for them as a community to they're really poor. On top of that, they don't have electricity, and it's quite difficult for them.
So this sounds like a real service issue. Can you assess then the DA's claim that the ANC in the run-up to elections is inciting this sort of protest action?
You know, Francis, it's quite interesting that you say that, because I actually asked one of the protesters whether or not this protest was a legitimate protest, or it was a protest that was coming on the backs of other service levy protests that they'd seen. And, the community says that this protest was a legitimate protest on their behalf. They were very angry, and they decided that at this point, this is when they're going to protest. However, it does raise the question of, in this week alone, the police have had to deal with at least 10 service delivery protests just in Gauteng. And it does raise the issue of, is there a third force, or are there other forces that are trying to spur on communities? But my assessment of this particular community's, service delivery protest around electricity, it was legitimate. The people don't have access to electricity.
There must be an element of demonstrators watching what's happening with demonstrations in other areas. Especially if you see the responsiveness, for instance, President Cyril Ramaphosa, president of the ANC, but then also addressing service delivery issues in Alexandra.
It certainly is a knock-on effect. You'll recall in Alexandra, just on Thursday, the president was there, and some of the protesters today in Kagiso were saying, why isn't the president in Kagiso? Why isn't he addressing the people? And coincidentally, the president actually was there with high-ranking ministers, because they had been there to attend the funeral of Minister Mvula Mkhonyane's ex-husband. And it was, it was such an interesting dichotomy, because where the protesters were, there were police, and it was cordoned off. But at the same time, around where the funeral area was, there were also police as well. But it almost seemed as if people were not communicating or talking to each other. And it was only later in the afternoon where the protesters were saying, well, we demand that the ministers and the president come and address us. And it was almost as if, because they'd heard about about it and they'd seen it somewhere else, they also wanted it there as well. And, you know, according to the chain of custody, the president really shouldn't be addressing a municipal protest. It should be the local councillors, the mayors. There is a chain of command that deals with these service delivery protests. So it really is quite an interesting time leading up to elections to see how, you know, how ministers and the president and councillors and mayors are going to be able to work together to addressing the core issues. At the end of the day, the people are protesting for a genuine reason. They need services. They haven't been getting services. How do all the arms of government work together to ensuring that the issues are addressed legitimately?
All right, Nozintombi Miya, thank you very much. She'll follow what happens in Kagiso. Now, Gauteng